Top 1. The Pompeii Eruption. In 79 AD, the Roman city of Pompeii stood less than 6 miles from Mount Vesuvius. It was not a declining settlement or a forgotten outpost. It was structured, economically integrated, and alive. Bakeries fired their ovens before sunrise. Wine amphorae moved through warehouses near the harbor. Wall paintings in deep reds and ochres reflected afternoon light. Water flowed through stone fountains fed by aqueducts stretching for miles. Nothing in the rhythm of that morning suggested interruption. Shortly after midday, the summit of Vesuvius ruptured. A violent explosion propelled a column of ash and volcanic gas more than 20 miles into the atmosphere. The sky darkened. At first, pumice stones fell like scattered hail, white and gray fragments striking rooftops and courtyards. Within hours, the fall intensified. Accumulation reached several feet deep. Roof beams began to crack. Courtyards filled. Streets narrowed as drifts pressed against doors and walls. The first phase of destruction was mechanical. Structures failed under weight. Movement slowed under debris. Visibility collapsed into a suffocating haze. Breathing became painful as ash saturated the air. Escape routes clogged with rubble. The city's infrastructure, engineered for trade, governance, and daily life, offered no defense against atmospheric collapse. Yet the most lethal force had not arrived. Late that night and into the early hours, pyroclastic surges descended the slopes. These were not rivers of lava. They were fast-moving walls of superheated gas, ash, and pulverized rock traveling at speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour. Temperatures may have surpassed 500 degrees Fahrenheit. The surges entered buildings, penetrated doorways, filled enclosed spaces within seconds. Evidence from skeletal remains indicates that many victims did not die from falling stone. They died from thermal shock and asphyxiation, a blast of heat and toxic gases overwhelming the lungs almost instantly. Bodies were found mid-step, curled against walls, shielding faces, clustered together in confined rooms. These were not prolonged struggles. They were sudden interruptions. By the following day, Pompeii was buried beneath layers of volcanic material exceeding 15 feet in some districts. Organic matter decayed over time, leaving cavities within hardened ash. Centuries later, when plaster was poured into those voids, forms emerged. A figure clutching valuables, a child pressed against an adult, a man collapsed beside a doorway. Final postures were preserved with unsettling precision. The eruption did not merely destroy the city, it sealed it. What makes Pompeii uniquely disturbing is the completeness of its preservation. Loaves of bread remained inside ovens. Graffiti survived on walls. Wooden beams, furniture, and pigments retained detail because oxygen was cut off almost immediately. The city became a geological archive of a single day, stratified, measurable, exact. Geological studies suggest that Vesuvius had shown warning signs in the years prior, including seismic unrest. But in a region accustomed to tremors, instability did not signal annihilation. Repairs from earlier earthquakes were ongoing. Adaptation created confidence. Confidence created delay. When the transition came, it was not gradual. No invading army breached the gates. No prolonged siege weakened its defenses. Within less than 24 hours, a functioning metropolis integrated into one of history's most powerful empires became an archaeological lair. Pompeii did not decline. It was interrupted. Its fall demonstrates a pattern that repeats across civilizations. Prosperity can coexist with latent geological risk for centuries. Energy accumulates beneath the surface without negotiation. When it is released, engineering skill, trade networks, and political power offer no exemption. If a city as organized and stable as Pompeii could vanish in a single eruption cycle, then urban permanence is not a guarantee of strength. It is a condition granted by forces that do not announce their deadlines. Top 2. The Herculaneum Firestorm. In 79 AD, less than 4 miles from Pompeii, the coastal town of Herculaneum faced the same volcano and yet met a different fate. Smaller in size but wealthier in character, Herculaneum overlooked the Bay of Naples with terraced houses, marble columns, and seaside villas that extended toward the water. The town had direct access to trade routes and served as a retreat for Rome's elite. When Vesuvius erupted, residents likely observed the towering ash column from a distance, believing the worst might pass them by. During the initial hours of the eruption, Herculaneum was not buried in heavy pumice the way Pompeii was. Wind patterns pushed much of the early fallout away from the town. Roofs did not immediately collapse. Streets were not instantly choked. This temporary reprieve may have encouraged hesitation. Some inhabitants fled. Others gathered belongings. Many appeared to have moved toward the waterfront, possibly intending to escape by boat. What reached Herculaneum later was not falling debris, but a series of pyroclastic surges descending the slopes of Vesuvius. These were not slow-moving lava flows. They were dense, ground-hugging clouds of superheated gas, ash, and volcanic fragments traveling at speeds estimated over 60 miles per hour. Temperatures within these surges may have exceeded 900 degrees Fahrenheit. The first surge that struck Herculaneum arrived in the middle of the night. Unlike the gradual burial experienced in Pompeii, this impact was sudden. Heat penetrated buildings instantly. Organic material carbonized. Wooden beams, doors, and furniture were charred yet preserved in place due to the rapid sealing effect of ash. Along the ancient shoreline, archaeologists later discovered hundreds of skeletal remains inside boat chambers and along the beach. For decades, it was assumed these individuals died from suffocation while waiting for rescue. More recent forensic analysis suggests a more immediate cause. Bone fractures consistent with thermal shock were observed. In some cases, skulls showed signs of explosive cracking caused by rapid exposure to extreme heat. Soft tissue vaporized. Brain matter in at least one documented case was transformed into a glass-like substance due to intense temperatures. Death likely occurred within seconds. The mechanics of Herculaneum's destruction illustrate a different dimension of volcanic catastrophe. There was no extended struggle against accumulating ash. No hours-long decision window. The lethal phase moved too quickly. The body had no time to process what was happening. This was not entrapment. It was instant exposure. Buildings closest to the shore were filled and sealed by successive surges. Ash deposits eventually reached depths of more than 60 feet in some areas, entombing entire neighborhoods. Yet paradoxically, the same forces that killed the population preserved structural details with extraordinary clarity. Wooden shelves remain, food containers survived, even multi-story houses retained their original layout. Herculaneum challenges a common misconception about volcanic disasters. The primary danger is often imagined as molten lava slowly advancing. In reality, pyroclastic flows and surges are the most lethal components. They combine heat, speed, and toxic gases in a form that outpaces human reaction time. At 60 miles per hour, no one outruns it. At temperatures approaching 900 degrees Fahrenheit, no shelter constructed from wood or stone offers meaningful protection. The town did not fall because it lacked wealth or engineering skill. It fell because it occupied a zone within the reach of stored geological energy. When that energy was released, the transition from normalcy to fatal exposure occurred faster than conscious decision-making. Herculaneum stands as evidence that some cities are not slowly erased. They are overtaken in a single thermal wave. And when destruction moves faster than awareness, survival becomes a matter not of preparation, but of pure distance from the source. Top 3. The Akrotiri Burial. Around 1600 BC on the island of Thera in the Aegean Sea, the city of Akrotiri stood as one of the most advanced urban centers of the Bronze Age. Multi-story buildings rose above paved streets. Walls were reinforced with timber framing designed to absorb seismic shock. Frescoes depicted ships, landscapes, and rituals in vivid mineral pigments. Beneath the streets ran a sophisticated drainage and sewage system, engineered to carry water efficiently through clay pipes. Akrotiri was not an isolated settlement. It was part of the wider Minoan maritime network that connected Crete to the eastern Mediterranean. Thera itself was a volcanic island, but volcanic landscapes were not uncommon in the region. The population had lived alongside seismic activity for generations. When earthquakes struck, buildings were repaired. When tremors cracked walls, reinforcement followed. Adaptation became routine. Then the volcano entered a phase that routine could not contain. Geological evidence indicates that a series of earthquakes preceded the main eruption. Some buildings show signs of damage that had already been cleared before the final event. This suggests that at least part of the population recognized escalating instability. Storage jars were found carefully arranged. Valuable goods appear to have been removed. Unlike Pompeii or Herculaneum, Akrotiri has yielded almost no human remains within the buried city itself. The eruption that followed was among the most powerful in recorded human history. The volcanic column is estimated to have risen more than 20 miles into the atmosphere. Ash began to fall across Thera and surrounding islands. In Akrotiri, deposits eventually reached thicknesses exceeding 30 feet in some areas. Entire structures were sealed under layers of compacted volcanic material. Unlike the rapid thermal shock that struck Herculaneum, Akrotiri's destruction unfolded in phases. Initial ashfall likely prompted evacuation. Later explosive stages generated pyroclastic flows and possibly tsunamis that radiated outward across the Aegean. The city was not incinerated in seconds. It was entombed. The physical result resembles a time capsule. Buildings remain standing to multiple stories. Staircases connect levels. Large ceramic vessels remain in storage rooms. Frescoes survive because ash deprived them of oxygen and moisture. The burial was so complete that the city's layout can be traced with remarkable precision. Yet what defines Akrotiri is not what was found, but what was missing. No mass graves, no clusters of skeletons in doorways, no clear signs of final panic inside the streets. The archaeological silence suggests that the population fled before the most violent phase of the eruption, but fleeing a city on a volcanic island does not guarantee safety. The eruption of Thera likely triggered massive tsunamis that struck coastal settlements across Crete and other Aegean islands. Marine sediment deposits found inland on parts of Crete point to waves that may have exceeded 30 feet in height. Harbors would have been devastated, ships overturned, coastal infrastructure destroyed within hours. Akrotiri demonstrates a different pattern of erasure. The city itself was preserved, but the civilization it belonged to suffered long-term destabilization. Trade networks fractured, maritime dominance weakened. While the Minoan culture did not vanish overnight, the eruption introduced a shock from which it never fully recovered. Here, the critical shift is not instant incineration, but strategic collapse. A volcanic event removed a key node from a network dependent on sea routes. In a world where power flowed through ports and fleets, damage to maritime infrastructure could ripple outward with lasting consequence. Akrotiri shows that a city does not have to contain bodies to represent catastrophe. A perfectly preserved urban landscape can still signify displacement on a scale large enough to alter regional balance. The ash that sealed its streets also marked a turning point in the Bronze Age Mediterranean. If a single volcanic island could disrupt interconnected trade systems 3,500 years ago, the vulnerability of any networked civilization becomes less theoretical. Stability depends not only on survival of a city, but on continuity of the systems that bind cities together. Top 4. The Timgad Desert Loss. In the 1st century AD, deep in what is now northern Algeria, the Roman city of Timgad rose from the edge of the Sahara with geometric precision. Founded under Emperor Trajan around 100 AD, the city was laid out in a near-perfect grid. Two main avenues, the Cardo and the Decumanus, intersected at right angles. An arch marked the entrance. A theater carved into the slope could seat thousands. Public baths, temples, a library, and colonnaded streets reflected the confidence of imperial engineering. Timgad was not improvised, it was planned. Its symmetry expressed control over environment and territory, yet that control depended on conditions that would not remain stable. The region sits within a zone influenced by both tectonic activity and long-term climatic shifts. Historical and geological evidence suggests that parts of North Africa experienced seismic disturbances during the Roman period. Structural fractures observed in surviving masonry point to episodes of ground movement that damaged buildings and weakened load-bearing walls. While no single earthquake has been conclusively tied to Timgad's decline, patterns of collapse in certain districts indicate sudden structural stress rather than gradual abandonment. But the more relentless force was not a single tremor, it was environmental transition. Over centuries, climatic patterns in North Africa shifted. Areas that once supported agriculture and sustained Roman settlements experienced increasing aridity. As water management systems deteriorated and maintenance declined, wind-driven sand began to encroach upon exposed surfaces. Streets filled incrementally. Courtyards accumulated layers of fine sediment. Roofless structures trapped drifting dunes. Unlike Pompeii or Herculaneum, Timgad was not buried in a single catastrophic afternoon. Yet archaeological evidence suggests that once infrastructure faltered, the transformation accelerated. Without constant clearing, sand can accumulate several inches in a single storm. Over years, that accumulation compounds. Doors become blocked. Foundations destabilize. Abandoned upper floors collapse inward under shifting weight. By the medieval period, much of Timgad had disappeared beneath the desert. The precise Roman grid, once a declaration of permanence, lay hidden under layers of sand. When the site was rediscovered and excavated in the 19th century, entire streets emerged almost intact, preserved by the same dunes that erased them from sight. The destruction of Timgad reveals a quieter mechanism of erasure. There was no firestorm, no volcanic plume, no towering wave. Instead, there was the breakdown of maintenance systems in an environment that demands constant management. A Roman colony engineered to withstand military threat could not withstand sustained ecological pressure. The desert does not attack with speed. It advances with persistence. Each grain is insignificant. Millions are transformative. Once agricultural output declined and water systems faltered, the city's economic core weakened. Population likely decreased. As labor dwindled, sand removal became inconsistent. The balance tipped. Timgad illustrates that vulnerability does not require explosive violence. A city positioned at the edge of a climatic boundary exists in negotiation with its environment. When that boundary shifts, urban stability becomes conditional. The Roman Empire invested heavily in roads, aqueducts, and fortifications. Yet even the most orderly urban plan cannot override regional climate change or geological instability. The grid remains visible today only because it was swallowed and sealed, not because it endured continuously. If a meticulously engineered Roman colony could vanish beneath sand once environmental thresholds were crossed, the lesson is not about ancient fragility. It is about dependence. Cities require continuous input of energy, labor, and ecological balance. Remove enough of those supports, and even stone yields. Timgad did not explode or burn. It receded, but the outcome was the same. A functioning urban center became an archaeological layer, preserved not by survival, but by abandonment under a shifting landscape. Top 5. The Heraclean Submergence. For centuries, Heraclean, known to the Egyptians as Thonis, was considered a legend. Ancient texts described a vast port at the mouth of the Nile, a gateway through which foreign ships entered Egypt before sailing inland. It was said to contain grand temples, massive statues, and harbors crowded with vessels from across the Mediterranean. Then it disappeared. Founded around the 8th century BC, Heraclean occupied a strategic position within the Nile Delta. This was fertile land, but geologically unstable. The delta consists of layers of water-saturated sand and silt deposited over millennia. Such sediment can support weight, but only under stable conditions. When shaken or overloaded, it can lose structural integrity rapidly. Archaeological surveys, conducted offshore in the late 20th century, revealed what lay beneath roughly 30 feet of water: colossal statues weighing several tons, temple ruins, shipwrecks, and entire districts preserved in silt. The city had not simply declined, it had subsided. Geophysical studies suggest that a combination of seismic activity, rising sea levels, and a process known as soil liquefaction contributed to Heracleon's fate. During a strong earthquake, water-saturated sediment can temporarily behave like liquid rather than solid ground. Buildings lose foundation support. Stone structures tilt, fracture, and sink. Entire sections of land can drop several feet within moments. In Heracleon's case, evidence indicates episodes of abrupt subsidence. Blocks of limestone weighing thousands of pounds were found toppled and partially embedded in compacted mud. Temple columns lay at angles inconsistent with gradual erosion. Instead, the pattern suggests sudden destabilization, followed by permanent inundation. Once parts of the city sank, seawater advanced. The Nile Delta is dynamic. Channels shift. Coastlines migrate. What may have begun as localized structural collapse evolved into progressive flooding. As sections of the urban platform dropped, adjacent areas became more vulnerable. The port infrastructure that once facilitated trade became a basin for encroaching water. Unlike Pompeii, there are no preserved voids capturing final gestures. Unlike Herculaneum, no evidence of thermal shock. The mechanism here was foundational failure. The ground itself ceased to function as ground. Ancient harbors depend on precise elevation relative to sea level. A difference of even a few feet can determine whether docks remain operational. If seismic movement lowered parts of Heracleion by several feet in a single event, quays would have been rendered useless immediately. Warehouses would flood, trade would halt, economic viability would collapse. What makes Heracleion distinct is the scale of its disappearance. Entire neighborhoods are now mapped beneath the Mediterranean. Divers swim through colonnades once exposed to sunlight. The seafloor preserves the geometry of streets and foundations, as though the city were paused mid-use. There is no evidence of a dramatic last stand, no signs of a siege or invasion. The archaeological record points instead to geological inevitability in a region built on sediment rather than bedrock. A city constructed to control maritime exchange could not control the behavior of the earth beneath it. Heracleion demonstrates a structural truth about delta civilizations. Prosperity often concentrates at river mouths, where trade converges. But these zones are inherently unstable. Layers of mud and sand accumulate faster than they consolidate. Add seismic disturbance, and stability can convert to collapse in seconds. When the platform of a city is composed of compressed sediment and rising waters, permanence becomes conditional. Heracleion did not burn. It did not erode slowly over centuries in plain view. It slipped downward, and the sea completed the transformation. If an economic gateway of ancient Egypt could vanish below the Mediterranean due to shifts measured in feet, the distinction between land and water becomes less certain. In coastal regions worldwide, elevation is not a guarantee. It is a temporary balance. Top 6. The Ugarit Collapse. Around 1200 BC, on the northern coast of what is now Syria, the city of Ugarit stood as one of the most important ports of the Late Bronze Age. Positioned along major maritime and overland trade routes, it connected the Hittite Empire, Egypt, Cyprus, and Mesopotamia. Its warehouses stored copper, timber, grain, and luxury goods. Its scribes recorded treaties and commercial transactions on clay tablets using one of the earliest known alphabets. Then, within a short span of time, Ugarit was destroyed. Excavations at the site reveal a thick destruction layer characterized by collapsed walls, burned beams, and smashed storage jars. In some buildings, tablets were found still inside archives, baked hard by intense heat. One letter discovered in the ruins appears to be a desperate message sent to a neighboring ruler, requesting military assistance against an imminent threat. The plea was never answered. For decades, scholars debated whether Ugarit fell primarily to invading groups often labeled as the Sea Peoples. While external attacks likely played a role, geological and environmental data complicate the picture. The eastern Mediterranean during this period shows evidence of widespread seismic activity. Sediment cores and fault studies indicate that the region experienced significant earthquakes around the same era. Structural analysis of Ugarit's ruins suggests sudden collapse rather than gradual abandonment. Masonry blocks shifted laterally. Walls appear to have buckled under horizontal stress. In several locations, fire damage overlays structural failure, implying that buildings may have been compromised by tremors before igniting. An earthquake in a dense port city would have immediate consequences. Multi-story buildings constructed of stone and mud brick could fracture in seconds. Roofs would fall inward. Streets would fill with debris. If storage areas contained oil or grain, secondary fires could spread rapidly through confined quarters. A city already shaken would struggle to contain flames. Compounding this instability, paleoclimate studies indicate that the Late Bronze Age experienced episodes of prolonged drought. Crop failures would have strained regional supply chains. In a tightly interconnected trade network, disruption at one node could cascade outward. Ugarit relied heavily on maritime exchange. If ports were damaged by seismic uplift or subsidence, docking infrastructure could become unusable overnight. The destruction of Ugarit appears not as a single isolated event, but as a convergence of stressors. Tectonic movement weakened physical structures. Fire sealed the damage. Political instability and economic strain limited recovery capacity. What matters is the speed at which a functioning urban system transitioned into irreversible collapse. Clay tablets recovered from the site preserve routine records written shortly before the city's end. Inventories, correspondence, administrative notes. There is no long narrative of decline within those final lines. The city was active. Trade continued. Governance functioned. Then the archive itself became part of the rubble. Ugarit's fall highlights a pattern seen elsewhere in the Bronze Age collapse. When multiple cities experience destabilization within a relatively narrow time frame, the vulnerability lies not only in individual structures, but in network dependence. Ports rely on roads. Roads rely on political order. Political order relies on agricultural stability. Remove or damage enough of these supports at once, and recovery becomes improbable. Unlike Pompeii or Herculaneum, Ugarit was not sealed under ash. Its destruction layer is charred and fractured rather than entombed. Yet the effect was equally decisive. The city ceased to function. Its alphabet survived in fragments, but its urban life did not. If a coastal trade hub at the center of an international system could disintegrate under the combined pressure of seismic shock and systemic strain, the fragility of interconnected economies becomes apparent. Ugarit did not simply fall, it fractured within a network that was already under stress. Top 7. The Tal el Hammam airburst. Around 1650 BC in the Jordan Valley, near the northeastern edge of the Dead Sea, the fortified city now identified as Tal el Hammam dominated its surrounding plain. Thick defensive walls enclosed administrative buildings, storage complexes, and residential quarters. Its position gave it control over trade routes linking the Levant with regions farther east. Archaeological surveys indicate a substantial urban footprint, with upper and lower city sectors designed for defense and governance. Then, in a single destructive episode, the city was violently terminated. Excavations reveal a distinct destruction layer unlike conventional burn horizons from warfare. Mud brick walls appear shattered outward. Pottery fragments show surfaces partially melted, with outer layers transformed into a glassy coating. In some areas, building stones display signs of extreme heat exposure. The temperatures required to produce such melting exceed what typical Bronze Age fires could generate. Analysis of shocked quartz and high-temperature mineral formations found within the destruction layer suggests exposure to intense, short-duration thermal energy. Laboratory studies indicate that such features can form under pressures and temperatures associated with explosive airbursts, similar in mechanism to the 1908 Tunguska event in Siberia. Though the scale at Tal el Hammam remains debated, the pattern of debris distribution is equally telling. Structures appear flattened in a directional manner, as if subjected to a powerful blast wave. Upper portions of walls are absent in ways that do not align with gradual erosion. Instead, they suggest rapid structural failure from above. If a large meteoritic body entered the atmosphere and detonated before impact, the resulting airburst would release enormous thermal radiation and overpressure. In seconds, temperatures near ground zero could spike high enough to ignite combustible materials instantly. Shock waves traveling faster than hurricane-force winds would follow, collapsing weakened structures. Unlike Pompeii, there is no deep ash blanket entombing the city. Unlike Ugarit, there is no extended evidence of siege or prolonged conflict. The destruction layer at Tal el Hammam appears thin but intense, marking a singular catastrophic event rather than a drawn-out decline. One hypothesis suggests that a cosmic airburst occurred above or near the settlement, generating temperatures potentially exceeding several thousand degrees Fahrenheit at peak exposure zones. Such heat would be sufficient to melt pottery surfaces and disrupt mineral lattices in building materials. If true, the inhabitants would have had no warning beyond a sudden flash and an expanding shockwave. The broader region shows signs of abandonment in the centuries following the event. Some researchers propose that soil salinity in the Jordan Valley increased after the destruction, possibly due to displacement of mineral-rich material from the Dead Sea Basin. Elevated salinity would have compromised agriculture, delaying resettlement. While interpretations remain under active scientific debate, the physical evidence of extreme thermal alteration is difficult to attribute solely to conventional Bronze Age warfare. The energy release implied by certain mineral signatures exceeds that of typical urban fires. Tal el-Hammam introduces a distinct mechanism into the pattern of ancient urban collapse. Here, the threat did not emerge from tectonic plates or volcanic vents. It came from above, delivered in a burst of energy measured in seconds. If an atmospheric explosion was responsible, the event would underscore a reality often overlooked in discussions of ancient vulnerability. Planetary processes include not only internal geologic forces, but also extraterrestrial hazards. The Earth's surface records impacts and airbursts across geological time. For a fortified city with walls designed to repel armies, there would have been no meaningful defense. Stone and mud brick offer no resistance to a thermal pulse or supersonic blast wave. The transition from structured urban life to flattened debris field would have occurred almost instantaneously. Tal el-Hammam stands as a reminder that some catastrophes do not build gradually. They arrive as a flash, a pressure wave, and silence. Top 8. The Baiae subsidence. Along the western coast of Italy near the Bay of Naples, the Roman resort city of Baiae once represented leisure and excess at the highest levels of imperial society. Senators, generals, and emperors constructed villas overlooking the water. Terraced gardens descended toward private docks. Thermal baths, heated by volcanic activity beneath the region, drew visitors seeking both relaxation and political influence. Baiae was not a defensive stronghold or a trade hub. It was a retreat. Its position within the Campi Flegrei volcanic field, however, placed it above one of the most geologically dynamic zones in the Mediterranean. Unlike Vesuvius, which erupts explosively, Campi Flegrei expresses instability through bradyseism, a process in which the ground gradually rises and falls due to magma movement and hydrothermal pressure beneath the surface. These vertical shifts can measure several feet over decades. To residents, the change might seem subtle at first. To architecture, it is decisive. Archaeological evidence shows that parts of Baiae experienced repeated subsidence beginning in antiquity. Stone columns now visible underwater bear marine boreholes at varying heights, indicating cycles of submersion and reemergence. Foundations once aligned with sea level are today several feet below it. For a coastal city, elevation is everything. Roman harbors required precise gradients for docking vessels. Bath complexes relied on stable water channels. As the ground slowly sank, seawater advanced inland. Lower floors flooded, mosaic surfaces deteriorated. Structural stress accumulated where walls met shifting foundations. The decline of Baiae was not instantaneous like Pompeii, nor violently abrupt like Herculaneum. Yet geological data suggests that certain phases of subsidence may have accelerated within relatively short intervals. A drop of even 3 to 6 feet in a single episode would have rendered sections of the city unusable immediately. Harbor installations would be compromised. Freshwater systems contaminated by saltwater intrusion. Excavations beneath the modern sea surface reveal entire rooms preserved underwater. Marble statues lie where they once stood in courtyards. Brick arches extend into green-tinted light. The seafloor outlines the geometry of streets that once echoed with conversation. The mechanism here was vertical instability. Campi Flegrei remains active today, monitored for uplift and seismic tremors. The same forces that once lowered Baiae continue to operate beneath the crust. Magma does not always erupt violently. Sometimes it shifts, inflates, and deflates, altering surface elevation over time. For a city dependent on proximity to the shoreline, repeated vertical oscillation is unsustainable. Each cycle weakens foundations. Each subsidence event increases vulnerability to storm surges. Over generations, maintenance becomes impractical. Abandonment follows. Baiae illustrates a different form of erasure. The destruction was incremental, but the threshold of functionality may have been crossed abruptly during key episodes. When infrastructure ceases to operate reliably, population disperses. The city transitions from habitation to ruin. What distinguishes Baiae is the visibility of its transformation. Divers today can trace walls and corridors beneath several feet of water. The sea did not wash the city away in a single wave. It inherited it. In geological terms, the land simply changed elevation. In human terms, a center of wealth and influence lost its foundation. The stone remained, the social system did not. Baiai demonstrates that permanence along tectonically active coastlines is conditional. Even absent explosive eruption, vertical motion of a few feet can redefine a city's viability. Where land and sea negotiate continuously, urban stability becomes a temporary agreement. Top 9. The Antioch Earthquake. In 526 AD, the city of Antioch stood as one of the largest urban centers of the Eastern Roman Empire. Situated along the Orontes River near the Mediterranean coast, it was a crossroads of trade, culture, and administration. Broad colonnaded streets cut through densely built districts. Churches and public buildings rose in stone and brick. Its population may have exceeded 200,000, making it one of the most significant cities of the ancient world. Antioch was also positioned near a major tectonic boundary. The region lies close to the East Anatolian Fault System, where the Arabian Plate presses northward against the Anatolian Plate. Stress accumulates along such faults over decades or centuries, invisible at the surface, until release becomes unavoidable. In late May of 526 AD, that release came. Historical accounts describe violent shaking that struck without warning, likely registering well above magnitude 7.0 by modern estimation. The initial seismic wave would have lasted less than a minute. For a city built with heavy masonry and multi-story construction, that duration was sufficient. Stone walls cracked along mortar joints, roof beams shifted, towers fractured under lateral stress. In narrow streets lined with dense structures, falling debris created instant obstructions. Those indoors faced collapsing ceilings. Those outside were exposed to cascading stone blocks and timber. The destruction did not end with the shaking. Oil lamps overturned. Cooking fires spilled. In a city of tightly packed buildings, ignition points multiplied rapidly. With water systems disrupted and streets blocked by rubble, firefighting efforts would have been chaotic or impossible. Flames moved through damaged districts, consuming what the tremor had weakened. Archaeological evidence supports a combination of structural collapse and intense burning. Charred layers overlay fractured foundations. Masonry displacement patterns indicate sudden horizontal movement, consistent with a strong earthquake. The sequence appears clear: shock, collapse, fire. Antioch had endured earthquakes before. The region is seismically active, and rebuilding was part of its history. But the 526 event appears to have exceeded prior damage. Contemporary reports speak of massive casualties, though exact numbers remain uncertain. What is evident is that large sections of the urban core were rendered uninhabitable within hours. For a metropolis dependent on centralized governance, trade flows, and religious institutions, such abrupt physical devastation carried systemic consequences. Administrative functions halted. Warehouses were destroyed. Roads leading into the city were likely damaged, complicating relief. Unlike Pompeii, Antioch was not sealed under ash. Unlike Baiae, it did not gradually sink. Its collapse was mechanical and immediate. A functioning imperial city transitioned into a landscape of rubble in less time than a single sunrise. Tectonic forces operate on timescales beyond human perception. Stress accumulates silently along fault lines at rates measured in inches per year. Yet when rupture occurs, displacement can measure several feet in seconds. That sudden shift translates directly into structural failure at the surface. Antioch's fate illustrates the vulnerability of dense urban centers built atop active fault systems. Engineering techniques of the ancient world could accommodate moderate tremors, but not extreme lateral acceleration. Once load-bearing walls failed, gravity completed the process. In the aftermath, Antioch was rebuilt, but never fully regained its previous dominance. Repeated seismic events over subsequent centuries compounded the damage. The 526 earthquake marked a turning point from which recovery was partial at best. The night Antioch broke apart demonstrates that size and influence do not confer geological immunity. A city at the height of its regional power can be reduced to debris by forces released in under a minute. When tectonic strain crosses its threshold, civilization becomes secondary to physics. Top 10. The Alexandria Tsunami. In 365 AD, Alexandria stood as one of the most influential cities of the ancient world. Founded by Alexander the Great nearly 7 centuries earlier, it had grown into a center of scholarship, trade, and engineering. Its harbor connected Egypt's grain supply to the wider Mediterranean. Massive stone breakwaters extended into the sea. Warehouses, temples, and administrative buildings lined the waterfront. Though the Great Library had already suffered earlier losses, Alexandria remained a symbol of intellectual and economic gravity. On July 21st, 365 AD, a powerful earthquake struck off the coast of Crete. Modern geological analysis estimates its magnitude above 8.0. The rupture along the Hellenic subduction zone displaced the seafloor dramatically, likely lifting sections by several feet. When large segments of ocean floor shift vertically, the water above responds instantly. Witnesses describe the sea withdrawing from the Alexandrian shoreline, exposing parts of the harbor floor. Ships that had been floating moments earlier were left stranded. Curiosity drew some residents toward the suddenly uncovered seabed. The pause did not last. Minutes later, a massive wall of water advanced toward the city. Tsunami waves generated by megathrust earthquakes can travel at speeds comparable to jet aircraft in deep water, slowing only as they approach shallow coastlines. As they compress, their height increases. Contemporary accounts speak of vessels carried inland and hurled against structures. Water forced its way through streets, overturning carts and tearing apart wooden frameworks. Harbor installations bore the brunt of the impact. Docks splintered, stone quays fractured under hydraulic force. Ships weighing several tons were lifted and displaced. The precise height of the waves at Alexandria remains debated, but geological modeling suggests they may have exceeded 30 feet along certain sections of the coast. Sections of the coastline appear to have been submerged by the sea. The ancient harbor is now a submerged archaeological site, with blocks of masonry and columns lying scattered beneath the water. Some of the ancient structures are still visible, but the majority of the harbor has been lost to the sea. Sections of the coastline appear to have experienced permanent subsidence, lowering parts of the urban edge relative to sea level. Combined with subsequent coastal changes, portions of ancient Alexandria now rest beneath the Mediterranean. Unlike the gradual sinking of Baiae or Heracleon, this event delivered impact within a compressed time frame. The earthquake itself may not have caused catastrophic structural failure within the city core, but the tsunami that followed introduced a secondary destructive phase. Buildings already shaken were struck by surging water. Foundations weakened by saturation lost cohesion. Warehouses near the docks would have been particularly vulnerable. Alexandria's position as a maritime hub amplified the consequences. Grain exports from Egypt fed distant populations across the empire. Disruption of port infrastructure reverberated beyond city walls. When a harbor ceases to function, trade halts. When trade halts, dependent regions feel the shock. The 365 AD tsunami did not erase Alexandria entirely. The city endured and continued to evolve. Yet the event demonstrated that even the most prominent urban centers of antiquity were not insulated from large-scale geophysical forces generated hundreds of miles away. What distinguishes Alexandria in this sequence is symbolism. This was not a peripheral settlement or a remote colony. It was a cornerstone of Mediterranean civilization, and yet within minutes of seismic rupture beneath the sea, water reclaimed part of its constructed edge. A megathrust earthquake does not recognize cultural significance. It responds only to accumulated strain along tectonic boundaries. When that strain releases, coastlines can be redrawn in a single morning. If a city as strategically engineered and globally connected as Alexandria could be struck by a wave borne far beyond its horizon, the boundary between stability and sudden disruption narrows. The sea that enabled its rise also delivered its vulnerability. These cities reveal a pattern that is difficult to ignore. Pompeii, Herculaneum, Akrotiri, Ugarit, Antioch, Alexandria. Different cultures, different centuries, different architectures. Yet each was operating as a functional urban system shortly before geological forces redefined its existence. None collapsed over slow moral decline. None vanished because knowledge was absent. They were interrupted by thresholds in the Earth's behavior. Volcanoes do not erupt gradually to accommodate evacuation schedules. Fault lines do not release strain in proportion to population density. Subduction zones do not calculate the economic value of a harbor before shifting the seafloor. The mechanisms differ, but the outcome converges. Infrastructure fails when physical limits are exceeded. A recurring element across these events is proximity to dynamic boundaries, volcanic arcs, tectonic plate margins, deltaic sediment plains, coastal shelves vulnerable to displacement. Ancient builders selected these locations because they offered strategic advantages: fertile soil, trade access, thermal resources, maritime routes. The same features that enabled prosperity also embedded latent instability. What appears stable over generations can, in geological terms, be temporary equilibrium. Stress accumulates along a fault at a rate of inches per year. Magma migrates slowly beneath the crust. Sea levels shift by fractions of an inch annually. These increments are imperceptible within a single lifetime. Yet when release occurs, displacement is measured in feet, not fractions. The lesson is not that cities should not exist near risk zones. Much of human civilization is concentrated along coasts and seismic belts. The lesson is that permanence is an assumption layered over dynamic systems. Ancient urban centers believed in durability because their walls stood for decades. Then those walls fractured in minutes. Civilization does not end because knowledge disappears. It ends when energy stored in the earth exceeds the tolerance of built structures. The question is not whether ancient societies were uniquely vulnerable. The question is how modern density, interconnected infrastructure, and coastal concentration alter the scale of consequence when similar thresholds are crossed again. If these stories of lost civilizations and the raw power of the earth have changed how you view the ground beneath your feet, please subscribe and like the channel. We are unearthing the history that time tried to bury. Help us plant the seeds for the future. The next treasury of the past will be open soon.